out of the sky. My dreams went crashing when you said goodbye. Who'd think that after all I've been to you, that you and I would be through? Stray.
Hello, and welcome to the H.P. Lovecraft Book Club. So I actually can't believe I've made it to this point. I'm finally reached the Shadow Out of Time. It's not his last story. We still got Haunter in the Dark, but I feel like I'm coming to the end of the stories he published and under his name. And then I realized ahead of me is still a whole bunch of revisions. All the revisions he wrote at the end of his career, so many of them. He was so active in that market at the end of his career. And then we still have to look at the Robert E. Howard letters, something I've been looking forward to. But we're reaching the end. We're getting kind of over the hump here. So it's kind of an exciting moment for me. So anyways, I'm going to start talking about Shadow Out of Time. I don't. There's actually quite a lot to say about the first half of the story. We'll see how long it takes me to say what I want to say about this. The second half, I guess, is less thick, less dense than the first half. My initial plan was to do the first 4 chapters and the second 4 chapters. In the next episode, maybe I'll cut that a little short, depending on how long it goes, because I think the second half is a little bit more about the exploration. There's some good stuff in it, but I think the first half is a little bit more interesting for most readers. This, I guess, it's a horror story in the fact that the supernatural is interrupting the life of someone. And if this happened to me, I'm certainly would be freaked out by it. But it doesn't have that kind of, it doesn't have like the body horror and the terror, I think, of the thing on the doorstep. And why do I mention that? Well, they're both mind swap stories, and they're both written somewhat next to each other. The Thing on the Doorstep was written in 1933. Shadow Out of Time was written in 34 and 35. It was published in Astounding Stories in June of 1936. So it actually came out before The Thing on the Doorstep. The Thing on the Doorstep actually was the last story that came out during his lifetime. At least maybe not including a revision or two, but it's... You might read this and think, another mind swap story. You might think, actually, another exploration of an ancient culture. It does both. And I think here the mind swapping is used to really explore another culture. It's kind of like what that very, very early story he wrote, Beyond the Wall of Sleep, was missing in a way. Beyond the Wall of Sleep, you just get this idea that of mind swapping aliens going into human bodies to experience life on Earth, but you don't get a sense of the broader cosmology, the history, the culture of that society. We just get a much more micro view of it. In Shadow of Time, we definitely get the history of this great race, and it's nice. So in this way, it kind of reminds us a lot about the Mountains of Madness or the Mound, in that it allows Lovecraft to explore another culture in depth. It's the shortest of those 3 tales I just mentioned, though. It's both the Mound and the Mountains of Madness are longer. This is more on the Mound side of length, but I do think it's the shortest. And actually, in terms of its exploration of the culture of in this case, we'll say the Great Ones, or the Yithians, I guess they eventually get called. But the Great Ones, I guess, is what they call the Great Race. The Great Race. They are... We get less, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. We get less about their culture than I think we do at the Mountains of Madness. So anyways, I think this story is really well constructed, by the way. It's in 8 chapters. And the first half deal with kind of like... is set essentially in Arkham. And the next 4 chapters are about exploration. So it's kind of like almost like 2 very different parts of the story, right? Which would make it interesting if it was ever adapted, I think. To kind of give equal weight to both. They're both about exploration, but the one's more exploring internally, exploring one's dreams, one's memories, one's the folklore, the culture, exploring that kind of stuff we've seen a lot in Lovecraft. And the second half is exploring a place and a location. Again, we've seen a lot of that in Lovecraft. So he's combining two things he does really well and has done a lot into one story, and he pulls it off effectively. I think this is one of his most beloved and well-known stories. In fact, I think the Yithian, the Great Race, is such an iconic character. I mean, it's the way it appeared in Astounding Stories. That weird cone thing with the head on the tentacle and the antennas, the round head, 10 feet tall, right next to that small human. I mean, that's such an iconic image. I think it's actually the cover of Astounding Stories that month was this image. It doesn't actually make much sense because I don't think he ever encounters them as humans. He's in the body, right? But to sell it as a science fiction story, I think the cover of that looks really well. And it's nice that his career is his contribution is being acknowledged by these big magazines at the end of his life. Of course, Astounding also published At the Mountains of Madness at the same time that The Shadow Out of Time came. And I just wonder, to what degree did these two stories, this year, 1936, how much this contributed to the popularity Lovecraft would enjoy later on after he died. Of course, some of that is of course, August Derleth and the Arkham House publication project and all that. I don't want to belittle that, but, the fact that having published in Weird Tales for so much of his life, that these two massive stories, these massive, well-known, popular stories, came out in the same year in Astounding, must have, is I think notable. And this is before, I guess, the heyday of Astounding, right, under the Campbell years, the 40s, 50s. But anyways, that's just a speculation. But it's certainly a big sale for him, at least in terms of reputation. So this story, chronologically, it's kind of a slow burn. It's like the first events happen, what's the date? 1908. The story sort of begins in 1908, and it ends on July 18th, 1935. So it's 22 years covering his, this whole experience, much of his life, right? The most important years of his life too, are bogged down in this. It's I don't think he's quite done this before, right? Usually it's a moment. Whisper in Darkness is a season. Mountains of Madness is takes place over a year or so. Other stories are just days or moments, but this is such an extended period of the character's life, right? It's his entire life, for all intents and purposes, right? Is occupied by these things. Now, the story begins in a way that's familiar to the readers of At the Mountains of Madness, in that we're warned not to explore. Quote, "It is for this later reason that I urge with all the force of my being final abandonment of all attempts of unearthing those fragments of unknown primordial masonry which my expedition set out to investigate." Very similar, right? And so he's still as At the Mountains of Madness, and they were written, a few years apart, but they were published at the same time. So the readers may have, felt they were kind of getting something that this writer is kind of obsessing about. But they both open in a very similar ways with this warning, and it's kind of a justification for the story. But while At the Mountains of Madness, there's an earnestness to it, this story is much more reflective, right? Because it's much more about his personal experiences and what's happened to him and his dreams and his life and his family. There's a more tragic element to it as well, which I think adds something to the story, and I think it does display a different kind of sensitivity and appreciation for a different type of story and character we get with this Peasley, Professor Wingate Peasley. No, Wingate Peasley is his son. He's Nathaniel Peasley is our is our narrator. He's a much more tragic figure than Dyer. At the Mountains of Madness, Dyer just had something bad happen. He had a bad day, essentially. Peaslee had a bad life. Like his whole life is unturned by these events, and again, it's just random. This is very Lovecraftian, of course. It's just like the cosmos interferes in our life in random ways, and it's not to take it personal. It's just it just happens to us, right? And he's very normal. He's not interested in anything occult. He's a boring economist. Which I'll get to that later on, because we meet the other people that get mind swapped by the Great Race. They tend to be like generals and scholars and philosophers, and then there's nobody economist from Arkham. That I can't quite explain, but I do appreciate that Lovecraft's trying to do this everyman character here, and he changes. He has to change. He has to adapt. His whole life has to go on a different track because of these events. So the story begins with this return to Arkham. So we know he's been to Australia. It's 1936, and he's returning on the ship to Arkham, writing down his story, the story of Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee. So this is all in chapter 1, if I didn't make that clear. So by this point, he had been writing in psychological journals for almost a decade. So he's kind of well known, but the story really begins in 1908, we're told. In particular, from 1908 to 1913, a 6-year period in which he had a strange amnesia. So we're told that, but we get his background. His background, we're presented, there's a little bit of race here, in the sense that he's presented as being of kind of particular New England stock. I am the son of Jonathan and Hannah Wingate Peaslee, both of wholesome old Haverhill stock, end quote. But you really do get the sense he's not like pushing. It's not about heredity. The last time he really does that is in The Shadow over Innsmouth. He's moved away from those themes partially. There are other interesting themes here about exploration, about cosmic horror, but I'm actually, it's not in The Thing in the Doorstep either, or even Dreams of the Witch House. It's not about family legacy anymore. So that's the last story that really does that, I think. Maybe some of the revisions get into that, but with the revisions, you're always dealing with something that's mixed, right? With something that's a little bit Lovecraft, a little bit someone else. It might be all Lovecraft, but, in some cases, but it's usually some kind of mix, right? Usually we can't give Lovecraft all the credit for those tales. So what else about him? Oh, and then he's happily married, right? He's married 13 years, married in 1896, 3 children. And now we're told he only has relationships with one of his sons, a professor of psychology. It's the only one who still talks to him. That's Wingate Peaslee, also of Miskatonic University. But no one else in the family wants anything to do with him because of this amnesia. And you don't blame him, because it really does seem like this guy just went crazy in 1908. It happened literally during a very boring sounding class, Political Economy 6, History and Present Tendencies of Economics. So this would, I guess, your 6th semester of economics. That's why it's juniors who take it. Happened at 10:20 a.m. exactly. Just at one moment, he collapses, and he wakes up as someone else. And this is 5.5 years. 5 years, 4 months, and 13 days he existed in this state until he kind of just went back to normal. Literally jumps right back into the lecture that he stopped, 5.5 years earlier. But he starts to get really weird. Like, he starts to study and know language. Like, he knows strange languages, but he also starts to study strange languages. He speaks differently. And that's all explained why this is throughout the story. The whole story comes together really, really perfectly. There's almost no really unanswered questions here. There's no odd. It's not like it doesn't have that bizarreness, I think, of like Dreams in the Witch House, where you're a little bit unsure quite what to make of everything. This story is much tighter, and everything that's kind of set up here, all the mystery set up in the first chapter are more or less explained by the time you get to the midpoint of the story. Quote, even my speech seemed awkward and foreign. I used my vocal organs clumsily and gropingly, and my diction had a curiously stilted quality, as if I laboriously learned the English language from books. The pronunciation was barbarously alien, whilst the idiom seemed to include both scraps and curious archaisms and expressions of a wholly incomprehensible cast. End quote. It, of course, reminds us very much of another kind of identity swap story, not really a mind swap story, but the case of Charles Dexter Ward. In which someone is found out, the villain is found out because he doesn't use the speech of the time, right? This guy, this Yithian that's taken over his mind, that's what's happened here. No need to have spoiler alerts for a story this old. He learned this, in a library, essentially, or maybe on some previous adventure in some other time, so he speaks strange. He's physically different, right? A little bit. He loses interest in his academic career. He starts to investigate occult stuff, for instance. He's spending all his time in the college libraries, but not reading economics, but reading all the strange texts, right? That characters in all of his stories, in this sense, Dunwich Horror, are obsessed with reading. And he becomes kind of a public figure. It actually kind of reminds me a little bit of, the media plays a role in quite a few of his stories. This is one, At the Mountains of Madness, has a lot of media elements. I think Dream of the Witch House, not so much. Shadow of Innsmouth, maybe a little bit. Whisper in Darkness, the media plays a role. These academic journals and academic debates. Dunwich Horror, Color Out of Space, these all are, the media plays a role in exposing these horrors. But the idea of the media here is that they're very fickle and they have a short attention span, right? So the media very quickly gets bored with whatever Nathaniel Peasley has to offer them in his weird amnesia. What else does he do? He travels to remote areas, becomes involved in cultish activities, occult activities. Quote, there is tangible proof in the form of marginal notes that I went minutely through such things as the Comte der Sculptor de Gaulle, Ludwig Prinz de Vermis Mysterious, the Unostersprechen Kulten of von Just. That's a Robert E. Howard story, or Robert E. Howard invented text, I think. Describing fragments of the puzzling Book of Ibn and the dreaded Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazared. Then, too, is undeniable that a fresh and evil wave of underground cult activity set in about the time of my odd mutation. I guess that's a little bit of a mystery in the story, is what exactly to make of the cult activity. It seems that he's pursuing knowledge. It doesn't seem the Yithians, the great race, are nefarious types. They're curious. They're explorers, they're historians, they're philosophers, scientists. They're like into Rising Cthulhu or something. So they're not quite that, but there's a curiosity about them, right? So maybe that's what leads him to participate in this. But the fact that there's an increase of activity, of cultish activity, after his revival suggests that maybe he contributed to expanding it somewhat. What else? Playing around with technology. He installed the mechanism, the most curious aspect. Yeah, there's a little bit more here about the cults, too. Maybe that's kind of a bit of something I would like to know more about, what's actually going on with the cult activities. It's sort of dropped by Lovecraft after the first chapter. Quote, on the evening of September 26th, I dismissed the lightkeeper and the maid till noon of the next day. Lights burned in the house till late, and a lean, dark, curiously foreign-looking man called in an automobile. It was about 1 a.m. that the lights were last seen. At 2:15, a policeman observed the place in darkness, but with the stranger's motor still on the curb. But he's a lean foreigner, so a little bit of the insidious foreigner is still here in this Lovecraft story. So he's not entirely immune from this, but I do think overall he's kind of moving away from some of those themes of like a culture besieged by immigrants. Like I guess the peak of that might be Horror at Red Hook, or to a certain degree, at the Shadow over Innsmouth. But anyways, we get a nice survey of all the weird stuff he was into during this amnesia, and then we're told he just one day woke up. It was, he woke up as if it was still that morning, that lecture in 1908, where he starts continue on with the lecture, exactly where he left off. So that's chapter 1. So chapter 1 tells us that period, 1908 to 1913, and sets up the context, that he's writing this on this boat, returning from Western Australia, and telling people, don't go back there. I think other people have noticed this, but a funny aspect of this is one of the members on this expedition that Peaslee ends up going on to Western Australia is Dyer, who just warned at the Mountains of Madness, like, don't dig up this weird stuff. Don't go back to Antarctica. It's really messed up. But, a few years later, he gets this chance to go to Western Australia, and he's all for it. Geology. Let's dig it up. It's a very similar kind of expedition. Actually, it's worse because the Antarctic expedition initially was core samples, right? This one is actually trying to dig up ancient cultures. Should have known better. Kind of fun. But now by this point, we get into chapter 2, where it's really about his return to daily life and the beginning of his dream. So much of the next 3 chapters, I don't know if it's even a good idea to go through this chapter by chapter for at least these next 3, because so much of this involves around a long period of Peaslee's life. We're talking like over a decade of his life in which he's confronted by dreams. He's confronted by the breaking up of his life. He loses his wife. He loses his kids. Only one of his kids really hangs out with him anymore. He can't really get his job back because he can't be an economist anymore because he hasn't kept up on the literature. It's such a realistic academic trouble, right? Like I know this because I've been in Asia for a long time, and it's like really tough if I ever want to get back into professional history, especially in the U.S., right? I mean, be published. I could do some things with publishing, but I'm kind of out of the loop, right? I haven't been going to conferences. I haven't been reading all the recent scholarships, especially these 3 years I've been in China. So I go and jump into Lovecraft nonsense, right? It's such a, realistic kind of struggle. You just can't get back into that. His family's gone. That's another very realistic trouble. Like people have bouts of alcoholism or bouts where they're in depression, and they come out of it better. They fix whatever was afflicting them. Hopefully they can live a better life, but they often lost a lot as a result of that. So it's a very human experience, and it's kind of a level of sadness that we don't often get in his stories, I think, to see the human consequences for just a normal family man for what the things that are happening. It's not the normal character, a single inquisitive young man like we've seen again and again. Now, Peaslee's troubles are worse because he's had this amnesia and he never quite recovers from it fully. And it manifests mostly in uneasiness. Quote, vague dreams and queer ideas continuously haunted me. And when the outbreak of the World War turned my mind to history, I found myself thinking of periods and events in the oddest possible fashion. My conception of time, my ability to distinguish between consecutiveness and simultaneousness seemed subtly disordered. End quote. So he's not totally right in the head by this. And he starts having these dreams. Can't really get back into academics. And he starts exploring other fields, right? This is worse for his academic career, right? If he said, okay, I'm going to go back and be an economist, catch up on the scholarship, get my job back. But he doesn't do that. He starts reading history. He starts reading occult stuff. He starts reading like a lot of psychology, and that because his dreams are leading him to do that. He can't really avoid that. And again, it's bad advice for a academic to do that. But I think it's a good thing. I think it's good to explore different things in the course of your life and try to master things. I think it's like that ADD mind, right? Like we try to cure ADD. In fact, it's just another way of learning, right? And it's a good way to learn. Some people are very creative because they explore different things throughout their life, right? I don't know. That's a kind of a bold claim, but I think there's something to that. And so maybe Peaslee is actually on some level, it's a story of someone, with a little bit of ADD in his life. He got bored with economics, so he decided to go to study the occult for a while and get involved in weird stuff. And then after that, study psychology and dreams. What's wrong with that, really? Not too much. On that surface level, anyways. Of course, there's much more going on in this story. Now, he does think about talking to alienists, talking to psychologists, because he does feel very alienated, both as a result of his investigations. As he thinks more about his dreams, he thinks more about what's happening to him, and he starts piecing things together. He does get a little bit disconnected from the world around him. Quote, "There was, too, a feeling of profound and inexplicable horror concerning myself. I developed a queer fear of seeing my own form, as if my eyes would sometimes see something utterly alien and inconceivably abhorrent." Unquote. Now, this is like a subconscious memory of when he was in the Yithian body, because it was a mind swap, right? So he was in the Yithian body, and he lived 5 years that way with the Yithians. And when he looked down, he was horrified at his body, right? Now, the memories were forgotten, but they still exist in the subconscious, right? They appear in dreams. And so he's got that visceral fear of looking down at his body, which I've had those moments too, and I gained a little bit of weight. But I've been exercising, so hopefully that weight is down and I can lose that terror. But I know where he's coming from. I get it. I mean, the Yithians are huge too, right? The great race is 10 feet tall, and it's got a booty. It's a cone-shaped thing. Now, his dreams kind of vary over time. And again, this is like, these 3 chapters cover like 10 years of his life and his experiences. But his dreams start to be like, I think they start out more like architecture and places. And he has senses of locations, architecture and even biology, gardens and these things, which, if you think about so many of Lovecraft's dream stories, they're involving strange architecture, strange gardens, strange landscapes, right? Even from some of his earliest stories, like some of his earliest revisions are really about dream landscapes and dream cities and stuff. Go way back in this podcast to my early look at some of his revisions, and you'll see that that's there. It's coming back here too. And over time, he developed more of a picture of this world that he seemed to inhabit. Right, and it happens over the course of the war, which is kind of an interesting aspect too, because how many people's profound sense of their place in the world, or their sense of their place in the world, experience profound change during the war? This happens to millions of people during the war who just were horrified by the violence, horrified by their experience in the trenches. Right? How many people came back from World War I like traumatized, right, and unable to relate to their family, and lost their family, right? Like Peaslee's experience here could have just been that of a soldier returning home, unable to fit in to his home world anymore, right? It's there's an aspect to it. I don't know if anyone's ever explored that, but I think this is such a common experience. It's presented here as so unique because you had your body taken over by an alien in this case, but the general experience of like losing touch of who you are because of some profound trauma, and then trying to make sense of it and learning more about yourself as you do it. It's I think it happens quite commonly, but the loss involved in this too, the losing of the family. It's all very heartfelt, and it's an aspect of the story I really, really like. So through an investigation of myth and an investigation of his dreams, and he goes to some of those same books that he studied as when he was the Yithian studied when he took over his body, he's able to kind of piece together some of what's going on. And he learns about the Great Race partially through other texts. Like he goes back to these things like the Un Australspredigen Kulten, these kind of books, which seem to talk about some of this stuff. So primal myths, his modern delusions, that's the way he puts it, combined to give him some answers. and he finds out about this great race. And to make a long story short, they time travel and space travel by mind swapping, right? So they're explorers, they're philosophers, they're historians. They're really weird looking. They're 10 feet tall cones with distendable limbs stretching from apexes, speaking and clicking and scraping huge paws and claws. So they're kind of intimidating, but they're basically sort of peaceful. Not that they don't have any wars in their history, but they're not really a nefarious, evil entity. They probably shouldn't be taking over people's bodies. But it's how they can know about the world. It's how they can explore the world, right? And how much violence do we commit in science? How much violence do we do to animals? How much violence do we do to the natural world in our quest to understand the world? So we're no better than the Yithians. Let's be real. It's like, yeah, they're taking captive people, but they seem to treat them quite well, as much as they can. And he gets into a lot of detail. Lovecraft takes a couple chapters here where he gets into a lot of detail about them. Like, there's even cases where some Yithians don't want to die, so they flip over permanently to another body, and this leaves the captive in the mind of a dying Yithian, but they're honored, and even if they die, they get like, they're memorialized. They're allowed to explore the library of the great race. They're given the freedom of motion. When they go back, though, they lose memories of that, except, I guess, the subconscious and the dreams. But it's really fascinating stuff. If you haven't read this story yet, I'm not going to go blow by blow with everything Lovecraft says here, but it's a really fascinating idea. And again, they're not really the worst possible. I would say we're worse to animals we experiment on than the Yithians are with these humans that they borrow their bodies for a few years. They take pains not to kill them or harm them. Anyways, he kind of puts together some understanding of what happens to him, and so he kind of gets his life back together, and he tries to like study a new field, and he tries to get into psychology, and his son is fairly supportive of him. His son becomes a psychologist at Miskatonic University. There seems to be doesn't seem to be enough jobs to go around in this world. So a lot of people end up at Miskatonic University for careers. He can't quite get back into economics because he's too escaped from the field, but he gets into psychology, and he's able to publish on psychology based on his own experiences. So he's able to look into his own adventures and knowledge about himself, and he can explore this kind of objectively as a scientist, but also as someone who had kind of a psychological incident. It's kind of reminds me of Wilmarth's kind of exploration of folklore in Whisper in Darkness to try to put an academic shell around these personal and very weird experiences. Now, through all these investigations, academic, exploring his own dreams, exploring the folklore, he's able to get a pretty full description of the great race. And there's a whole chapter here. It's chapter 4, which I think might be the longest in the whole story, where he just gets into all the different aspects of their life and their history. And it's good stuff. Now, it's also here we get the description of like their technology, their writing system. We get a longer description of their bodies. We also get he starts to remember more of his experiences when he was at the City of the Great Race. And the people he talked to, and I mentioned this before, like the people he talked to are all these different aliens, right? It's really a wonderful experience for him because they all look weird. And in fact, in Astounding Stories, they had an artist, Howard V. Brown drew all this pantheon of different weird creatures. So there's like an elder thing here. There's all these other weird monsters. A lot of imagination went into the art here. Lovecraft didn't describe too much of this in detail. But the people he's talked to, he's talking to like generals and philosophers and like so imaginative. Quote, I talked with the mind of Yang Li, a philosopher from the cruel empire of Shangcheng, which had come in AD 5000, with that of a general of the great-headed brown people who held South Africa in BC 50,000, with that of the 12th century Florentine monk named Bartolomeo Corsi, with the king of Lomar, who had ruled that terrible polar land 100,000 years before the squat yellow Inuits came west to engulf it. End quote. That's, of course, a mention of Polaris, one of his first stories. A nice circle there. One of his first stories and one of his last have that same mention. It's a little bit racist, but whatever. It's nice to have that shout out, I guess. So my point is, they go into the minds of these prominent people, because that's who's hanging out with him in these Ythian bodies. And he's just an economics professor. So why'd they take him? We're also told like the future of the Earth is going to be replaced. Humans are going to be replaced by a beetle civilization. There's a central library that they're allowed to explore. Now, it all culminates in this realization, because they're time travelers. They're able to travel through time and space, that they know their civilization is doomed. They know they won't survive deep into the history. They know they're kind of declining. And they're kind of, it's not ennui about it, but their stoicness about it, I think, is really admirable. You know, they have their historical ups and downs. They were an empire that had their great wars, their conflicts, their civil wars, all the things a great civilization has. And they know they're declining, as all civilizations will, and they choose to then spend their efforts just learning more and expanding their library and all that. So there's something really, really attractive about them. I think a lot of readers dig this aspect of the great race. Let me think. Is there anything else to say? Oh, their economic and political structure. I'll end on that. There's, of course, a lot of details throughout this chapter 4 about society of their city and their library and all that. But it's relevant what he says about their economic system in contrast with some of the things Lovecraft was writing, I think, you see in volume 4 of his selected letters, and some of the stuff he writes to Robert E. Howard, as we'll see later on. He writes, quote, "The political and economic system of each unit was a sort of fascistic socialism, with major resources rationally distributed and power delegated to a small governing board elected by the votes of all able to pass certain educational and psychological tests. Family organization was not overstressed, though ties among persons of common descent were recognized, and their young were generally reared by their parents." End quote. So just to be clear here, they reproduce asexually, so they don't really have normal families, but they do have parental relationships, right? We're also told they're post-scarcity, and one reason they have so much time to wander about space and time is because everything is kind of mechanized, and their needs are met by a mechanized society. So they're post-scarcity. It's really a utopian vision of society in a way, and we see in Lovecraft's letters him playing with a similar idea that when you have a machine culture, you're going to have some sort of like technocratic leadership, right? But there's also the potential he's realized there's the potential for some kind of post-scarcity sort of socialism, right? If everyone's needs are met, this will, I guess, ideally allow people to explore their interests and allow a flourishing of culture, right? But it also leads to overall cultural decadence too. I think he doesn't quite nail down if this is the cause of the Ythians' decline here, but certainly it's something he's thinking a lot about in his letters. Right. So I guess I want to leave it on that. I don't want to say too much more about this. I have a whole other episode where I'll explore the other half. And if there's anything else I want to come back and mention, I will. But I think that kind of covers the main ideas here. So anyways, that's going to be it for now. I'll give you my final thoughts about The Shadow Out of Time next time. Obviously, I think it's a great story, and I like it. And it grows on me. I used to not think that much of this story, but like some of the other of his later stories, I'm appreciating it a lot more as I come back and really try to dig into them with a little more detail. So anyways, you can send me your own thoughts about The Shadow Out of Time at my email address, 100pagescast@gmail.com, or you can reach me on Twitter, Evan Lampy1 on Twitter. You can leave a comment on or review on iTunes. That'd be really helpful. And most importantly, continue to listen to this podcast as I go down the hill, get to the final stretch. Got another probably 35 episodes maybe, so that's another 3-4 months of episodes for at least. I might have to come back and do some cleanup. There's a lot of little poems and stories that I might have to. There's actually that romance story he wrote I never covered either. Might have to come back and fill in that gap. But we'll see. Maybe I won't do it. Some people pressure me to fill all these gaps. I don't think I need to necessarily, but there are gaps that could be filled. I might do that, but we'll see where it goes. At the very least, we got all his later revisions, all the revisions he wrote after 1932, and then the Robert E. Howard letters, which covers a broader period. It starts in 1928 at 29, I think, maybe 1930, and through to the end of Robert E. Howard's life, anyways. And those are really long, sprawling letters, and we got most of the text of them, so they're not as edited down as they are in the selected letters. So it's and that's just scratching the surface of the letters, right? There's so many. Hippocampus Press has published so many books of his letters. If I just keep, this will never end if I don't, close the door on it at some point. And I'm getting to that point where maybe I think there's not much more to say about H.P. Lovecraft from my particular point of view. But anyways, enough about that. See you next time as I finish up my thoughts on The Shadow Out of Time. Thanks for listening.
Gee, it breaks my heart to see you day after day, turning away, as much as to say, you've never known me, stranger. After sharing all your kisses